Hello everyone. Today we're going to be going over how to simplify a square root, especially when the square root is not a whole number or what we call a perfect square. So the first terminology we want to focus on is the word radical. So this word radical is just the square root symbol that you're used to seeing, but it's actually got a name. It's called a radical symbol. So this guy right here. All right, a radical expression is an expression that contains or involves the radical symbol. So for example, we can have something like 7 square root of 3x plus 9. This would be a radical expression because it contains the square root of a number 3 in this case. All right, so a perfect square, I just mentioned this at the beginning. We're going to be simplifying square roots that are not perfect squares. So a perfect square is a square root, a number whose square root is an integer. So and again, by integer, I mean a whole number. So pretty much like the square root of 81 would give me a whole number of 9. So these are called perfect squares because the answer is a whole number. But there are other radicals that are not perfect squares. So here we have in this little section the perfect squares. The square root of 1 is 1. The square root of 4 is 2. The next one is 9 because 3 times 3 is 9. And then we have 16 is the next perfect square because square root of 16 is 4. Go ahead and pause the video for a second and fill out the rest of the perfect squares. All right, so you should already have the rest of the perfect squares. You should have the following: 25 from 5 times 5, 36 is 6 times 6. Then the next number should be 49 from 7 times 7. This is 8 times 8 is 64. 9 times 9, we should have 81. 10 times 10, 100. 11 times 11, 121. The next one's 12 times 12, 13 times 13, and so on. So the perfect squares go on forever. That means there's an infinite number of them. But any number not on this list would be considered a non-perfect square. So we need to be able to simplify those as well. So let's go ahead and start our examples. We are going to simplify these non-perfect squares. So how does that work? So let's look at the first one. We have the square root of 18. So when we're looking at non-perfect squares, automatically you don't see the answer. It's because we need to be able to figure out a way to simplify it. So I know that in 18, we are looking for a perfect square that is a factor of 18. So if I look at my perfect squares, which of the perfect squares is a factor of 18? So I should know that 9 is divisible by, divides into 18 or is a factor of 18. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a multiplication property where I can split the 18 into 2 factors. And I'm going to use 9, not 6 times 3 because 6 and 3 are not perfect squares. So I'm going to rewrite this as the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. Remember, I'm choosing 9 because I know that 9 is a perfect square. And I tend to write my perfect square first and then the non-perfect square behind it. So because 9 is a perfect square, I'm going to be able to simplify it. So the square root of 9 becomes a 3. And the square root of 2 is not a perfect square. It does not simplify, so it stays square root of 2 right behind it. I don't need to write the dot because if it's next to it, it's automatically a multiplication. So this is how I simplify non-perfect squares. I look for a perfect square that is a factor of it. So let's look at 25. We're thinking of which of the perfect squares on my list above are factors of 75. And you should know that 75 is a multiple of 25. So I'm going to use square root of 25, which is a perfect square, times, and 25 times 3 is 75. Simplify the square root of 25 to 5 and bring them the radical 3. And that's pretty much the general idea. So let's go to the next one, 80. What perfect square is a factor of 80? Now, the more common one people will think of is the square root of 4. Don't write this down, please. And they'll go square root of 4 and 20. But the general idea here is you want the biggest perfect square. This is going to be partially simplified because 20 has another perfect square in it. It's got another 4 in it. So technically we have 2 perfect squares, which become another perfect square. So instead of doing 4 and another 4, I am going to simplify this. Instead of 4 times 4, I'm going to use 16. That means 16 is a factor of 80. So I'm going to use 16 times 5. And yes, 4 is a factor as well, but I want the biggest one to simplify it as much as possible. So square root of 16 is 4. Bring down your radical 5. That doesn't simplify. Let's go to our next one, 30. The square root of 30. What perfect square goes into 30? So once you go down the list, you're going to see that none of them go in. The square root of 1 doesn't do anything. The square root of 4 doesn't go into 30. The square root of 9 doesn't go into it. 16 doesn't go into 30. Square root of 25 doesn't go into it. 36, it's too big already, so none of these go into 30. So because none of these numbers go into the square root of 30, that means it cannot be simplified. So the square root of 30 stays square root of 30. Not everything is gonna simplify. So not all radicals simplify. Sometimes they're already simplified as much as possible. Square root of 9 is already a perfect square, so this is just going to be 3. So make sure you're still recognizing the perfect squares when they're mixed in with non-perfect squares. Let's go ahead and do the next few. If you want to pause it here, that would be a good idea, and then come back and watch the video. Otherwise, if you're still not quite there, just keep watching the video as is. So 12, perfect square. Which one goes into 12? You should have 4. 4 is a perfect square. 4 times 3. 2 radical 3. Next one, what perfect square goes into 32? And the number is 16. If you chose 4, always check 16. If you're choosing 4, because sometimes 16 always goes into the number, and it might help you simplify it more. So 16 times 2 in this case, and we get 4 radical 2. Next one, 60. What perfect square goes into 60? In this case, we can say 4. 4 times 15. And we get 2 radical 15 to simplify. All right, square root of 23. What perfect square goes into 23? And again, nothing goes into 23. Going down the list, 4 doesn't go into 23, 9 doesn't go into 23, 16 doesn't, and 25 is over. So no perfect square goes into 23. It's not a factor of it. So this just stays square root of 23. It's a non-simplifiable radical. And 200. What perfect square goes into 200? You may have chosen 25, but there's actually a bigger one, 100 times 2. So you chose 25. Again, if you check always check 100 if you're picking 25 or it ends in zeros, hundreds go into it. So 10 radical 2. So that's the general idea of how to simplify a perfect square. So go ahead and start your practice page, and good luck.